How you doing, John? I look forward to talking to you.
Doing very good.
Same here, Mr. McDevitt. No, we're absolutely honored to have you on, and I think the most proper place to start is when you began practicing law. Did you ever see yourself getting involved in the crazy world of professional wrestling?
No. My law firm at the time was what would be regarded as sort of a white shoe law firm, which tended to do Fortune 500 corporate work, and I think representing the WWE would have been the furthest thing from my mind when I started there. Well, when I got out of college, I had majored in biology and chemistry, and when I went to college, I wanted to be a doctor, at least until I had to go in labs and do dissections, which I didn't really like doing all that much. So when I came out of college in my senior year, I had been working 40 hours a week because I didn't have any money, and I was driving a beer truck and sort of wondering what I was going to do with my life, and started thinking about law school when I got into a dispute with my landlord over my security deposit. She wouldn't give me back my $250, which at the time was a lot of money to me. And so I went to the law library and sort of figured out a way that if she didn't give me back the money, I could get double that amount, which I did. And I thought, well, that was kind of fun, but I still didn't have any money, so I decided I would go into the Marines for a couple of years to get the GI Bill. And when I was in the service for a couple of years, I had a lot of experience with the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and I also got a chance to see some of my Marines, I was a Marine lieutenant, being mistreated, I thought, by the civilian justice system. And in particular, I had one experience with one of my favorite sergeants who got married to some older woman who wanted the PX privileges and was pushing him for money, and he made a mistake and went out and stole an air conditioner one night from somebody's house, took it to the pawn shop, got caught and charged with felony larceny, couldn't afford an attorney, and asked me if I could help him. And I told him I'm not a lawyer, but let me see what I can do. So I went over to the law library and started looking at law books and found out that felony larceny in North Carolina, where I was stationed, was something like if you steal something over $500. And so I talked to him and I said, do you have any idea what the value of that was? And he said, no. And I said, well, do you know the name of the guy you stole it from? And he said, yeah. I said, give me his name. So he did, and I called the man and introduced myself and said I was Lieutenant McDevitt and I was Sergeant Wicks, troop commander, and he wanted to make restitution. Could he tell me how much he paid for the air conditioner? And he told me something like $300, which I immediately recognized then. Sergeant Wicks was charged with something he didn't do. He committed misdemeanor larceny, but not felony larceny. There's a big difference between the two, one you go to jail for, one you pay a fine. So I was a little bit naive at the time. I thought the prosecutor would want to know this, so I got the receipt, went down to the courthouse with Sergeant Wicks and asked to see the prosecutor out in the hallway. And I said, introduced myself and said, look, you have this man charged with felony larceny. That's $500. Here's the receipt for the air conditioner. It was only $300. And I actually thought at the time he would be happy and would, say, oh, gee, I'm really, really glad you found this out. But he looked at me with his jaundiced look and he said, Lieutenant, are you practicing law without a license? Which frankly pissed me off. And I said, well, I didn't think I was, but frankly, if I have to go get a lawyer, I'll take money out of my own pocket if I have to, but you're not going to railroad this guy for something he didn't do. So it's your choice what you want to do. And that was kind of my first experience with the legal system in that way. I guess it's always carried with me that people can be treated enormously unfairly by the legal system if they don't have adequate counsel. And so that stayed with me when I was in the service, and then when I got out of the service, I just decided I wanted to go to law school, and that's what I did.
How was your day-to-day experiences serving in the Marine Corps? Especially, I'm sure, how did that day-to-day service really treat you and prepare you for what you'd be doing later in life?
It's funny because up until that time, I think, you go to college, you're basically dealing with people who are pretty honest people and tell you the truth and whatnot. And at that time in the Marines, when I went in, it was like 73 to 76. Back in those days, when kids would get in trouble, the judges would often tell them they had their choice between going to jail or going to the Marine Corps. And so I had something like 80 troops under my command. I was a communications electronics officer. And I think something like 60 of them didn't even have a high school degree. And some of them were, frankly, not very good kids. Criminals, basically, that were put in there. And they were always sort of a disciplinary problem. And I always remember this one episode back in those days. I don't know how old you guys are. You're probably too young to remember this. But back in those days, they used to have these radios in the car and whatnot that had a telephone kind of connected. It had a telephone sort of handset that was all the rage if you had those in your CB radios. Well, those were also what we used in the radios in the communications electronics aspect of the Marine Corps for command and control of the troops and whatnot. So they were a hot item, and they were always being stolen from our comm shop, and we could never figure out who was doing it. So one day I pulled into the parking lot, and there was this private there who had been busted many times, just a bad kid, standing there with the trunk open in his car with his arms full of these handsets. And he was about to put them in the trunk. And I remember thinking, I got this guy dead to rights. And so I pulled up and said, Private Windsor, what the hell are you doing? And without blinking, he looks at me and goes, Lieutenant, he says, I know we've been having a lot of problems with people stealing these things, so I figured I'd come in here early this morning and put them in my trunk for safekeeping. And I think that was my first experience of having somebody just look me in the eyes and absolutely stone cold lie to me, which is good training for when you become a lawyer, because unfortunately that happens a lot in our business. And so I think it sort of helps you grow up. It takes you from sort of the naive college kid to a little bit more experienced in the ways of the world. And also seeing the court-martial process and all the rest of that kind of stuff, I think really gave me some sense of what the point of the legal process was. It was the greatest thing I ever did with going to service. It just by finishing up that last one, he didn't get over. He got court-martialed for that. And, but no, actually, I grew up in Johnstown, and then I came to Pittsburgh after I got out of the service to go to law school here at Duquesne University here in Pittsburgh, and loved the city, and I've just never left.
Now, obviously, being in Pittsburgh, it's not very close to Connecticut, but it's not too far from Connecticut. So how did you end up in the crazy world of WWE, and where did Vince McMahon meet you?
My first time with WWE came in 1987. Back then, Jim the Anvil Neidhart and Bret Hart were the tag team champions, as I would learn. And they were flying into Pittsburgh one night to perform up at the Civic Arena in January of 1987. And at the end of the flight, the FBI went on the plane and arrested Jim and charged him with a federal felony of interference with the flight crew. The allegation being that he had supposedly punched the flight attendant in a dispute over drinks. At that time, I had been working on a case out in Colorado with a fellow who was then representing Vince and Linda in the early days of the WWE by the name of Ted Dinsmore. And so when Jim got arrested, Vince and Linda called Ted. Ted in turn called me and asked me if I would be willing to represent the guy. And I knew absolutely nothing really about Jim Neidhart or really the WWE at the time. I guess I probably had heard of it, but I really wasn't a fan. I hadn't watched it, whatnot. And so I said, well, tell him to come see me in the morning. So, again, keeping in mind my law firm was sort of white-shoed, dressed down corporate people. Jim shows up the next day with these wraparound shades, a ZZ Top beard. I'm sure you guys know who he is.
Oh, yeah.
It was one of the scariest looking people you'll ever meet in your life. But turned out to be a hell of a nice guy. And what I remember mostly about it was that the day he came in, he was in abject terror that he was going to have to call this guy named Vince. And I kept thinking to myself, Christ almighty, what's this Vince guy like if this guy's scared of him, for Christ's sake? I mean, this guy looks like the scariest looking human being I've ever seen. I can't wait to meet who this Vince guy is, you know. And so he did. He had to call Vince and tell him about the trouble he was in and all the rest of that, and got his butt chewed out and all the rest of that. But in any event, so I went on to represent Jim, and he was acquitted of all those charges. And the next day I brought a malicious prosecution case against U.S. Air and the 3 flight attendants who had caused him to be arrested for charges that turned out to be categorically false. He didn't do anything like what they said he did, and ended up getting him a couple $100,000 for his troubles over that. And I think that kind of got Vince's attention a little bit, because I don't think he had a great love affair for lawyers at that point, still doesn't, as a matter of fact. And that's sort of the beginning of the relationship that I had. From there, shortly after that, there was in the Middle District of Pennsylvania a federal grand jury in the late 80s started looking into the affairs of the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission doctor, a fellow by the name of Dr. George Zahorian. Back in the late 80s, and actually throughout the 80s, under federal law at the time, it was not a crime of any kind to possess or use anabolic steroids for any purpose, whether it was for bodybuilding or performance enhancement or anything like that. And in late 1989, they passed a law which went effective in 1990, the first time making it a federal crime to possess or use steroids for other than medicinal purposes. And so the government was using Dr. Zahorian, I think, to try to get a high-profile trial to advertise, if you will, this change in the law about anabolic steroids. And Dr. Zahorian, as matters turned out and was later learned, was essentially selling steroids to just about everybody, people at Penn State, prison guards, prisoners, and also a couple WWE performers, including Hulk Hogan. And so I got involved in that grand jury when it was going on, sort of monitoring what they were doing to see who they were going to bring charges against. And at the end of that grand jury, they, when they were nearing the point they were going to indict Dr. Zahorian, they announced that the last witness they were going to try to bring to the grand jury was going to be Hulk, which was obvious they were doing only for publicity purposes. So I indicated to them at that point in time that I would represent Hulk in connection with their attempts to drag him through what Dr. Zahorian had done when Hulk and nobody else had done anything illegal. And I represented Hulk in that situation, ended up making an argument to the judge that it was illegal for them to do that for various reasons, which he agreed with me on, and quashed their attempts to drag Hulk through that trial as a witness and whatnot. And Zahorian ended up getting convicted of various different offenses. From that premise, which occurred in late 1990, then there was a second investigation up in the Eastern District of New York in the early 90s that then ended up, was just an ordeal like none I've ever seen, where this ambitious prosecutor up there just was basically legally stalking the company, looking for anything he could to try to wreck the lives of the McMahons and put the WWE out of business. And I represented them throughout that, including the eventual trial that resulted in acquittal of all charges. And that's sort of, in a narrative form, how my relationship with the WWE kind of started and got underway. And then after the criminal trial, I mean, you go through stuff like that, you form kind of a lifelong bond with the people that you go through that with, and we've just been very close ever since.
Absolutely, because you definitely you saved his butt a bit. Obviously, you kind of saved Hogan a bit, and the thing is, people always say you're kind of Vince's secret weapon. You're always getting this guy out of trouble and that guy out of trouble. But how close was Vince to serving jail time? Because we had Jerry Jarrett on the show, and he was talking about how Vince at that point was bringing him in to possibly take over just in case things went south.
Well, to be honest with you, I don't think he was ever close because the charges were so ludicrous that I was pretty confident that I would be able to defeat them. But you never know for sure because, we had a lot of strange circumstances. We had a judge who was 85 at the time of the trial and had been a very notable judge and had a wonderful career. And I certainly don't want to say anything that demeans his memory, but the reality was that he would vacillate between lucidity and senility in the middle of the trial, which is kind of a scary thing to see when your liberty is at issue. But the charges that they had brought were so ludicrous that I was confident that even if they could get a conviction, which I didn't think they could, that I would win on appeal. The charges were these cockamamie charges because there had been nothing done illegal. As I said to you, the fact that wrestlers had used steroids in the 80s violated no federal law. So they concocted this charge that they called basically a conspiracy to defraud the Food and Drug Administration in its attempts to regulate the distribution and manufacture of anabolic steroids, which was a farce. We never dealt with the FDA. You can't defraud a government agency that you never deal with. And it was just a trumped-up charge that frankly gave me a chance to put the FDA on trial for what its attempts to regulate steroids really was. And I ended up in that trial. I basically, what I did for 2 years, I just learned everything you could ever learn about steroids, from how they were made to who manufactured them to how the government approved them. I knew more about anabolic steroids by the time I went to that trial probably than any doctor on the face of the planet Earth. And I used that knowledge to demonstrate the utter hypocrisy of the government charging anybody with defrauding the Food and Drug Administration, because the Food and Drug Administration had been knowingly permitting some of these manufacturers of anabolic steroids to sell them to the people after they had determined they were not safe and effective for human use. And I showed that to the jury, and it just appalled them. And so we didn't even call a witness. All I did was cross-examine the people that the government brought in as their witnesses, and the jury didn't have any problem acquitting of all charges.
And you mentioned a little bit before, you said, you and Vince had a great bond. Obviously, you did your job very, very well, and obviously he was very happy with that. But what is that bond like? What's the relationship like with Vince? Like, how would you describe Vince, the person? Because everyone always sees, Vince TV, Vince, even Jim Neidhart, Vince the intimidating boss. How would you describe Vince?
I think he's a fascinating person. One of my favorite stories about Vince is, when you first undertake to represent anybody as a lawyer, you form judgments about the people you're representing and whether you want to get emotionally invested in them or whether you don't. What kind of person is this? Are they honest? Are they truthful? Whatnot? But in the early days, when I was forming my relationship with him back in the early 90s, during the time the government was doing all this, it was a horrible time because the tabloid wars were going on, and there were all these horrible, sensational stories and telling these lurid and false tales about people up there, and just miserable times dealing with the New York Post and whatnot. And what I always remember is one day when, the headlines were just terrible and just lurid and false and the kind of stuff that would make everybody angry, we were walking out of his office late at night one night, and there was this fellow that I don't even remember his name. I think it was Nick something. He was the janitor in the building up at the WWE. And I learned later that he had a need for a dialysis machine in the building in order to keep his job, which they did, just to keep this janitor working there. And so anyway, I came out of the office and we were walking out, and I saw him standing there sort of mopping the floor and whatnot. And Vince came out of the office right after me. He was walking down the hallway, and this guy saw him, and he just said, "Hey, Vince." And Vince turns around, and it was a hellish day, and goes back and starts saying, "Hey, how's your family? How you doing?" And took the time to care about that little guy, the janitor in the damn building that, most people probably wouldn't even know his name, but he did. He cared about him. And I thought, that's kind of an interesting scene that I have never forgotten about Vince. And apart from that part of him, I mean, as a businessman, he's fascinating to watch. It's I think he is the great marketer of our era. What he has done with this business is just mind-boggling when you watch WrestleMania and you see the production values and the people from all over the world that come to see it. It's extraordinary what he has done. And then when you see the influence on television, it goes beyond wrestling to when you see how politicians now use the sort of the ring entrance mode to build drama for themselves in various ways, and how the NFL has stolen, if you will, some of the camera techniques that were used in the XFL and all those kind of stuff. His influence on television and marketing is extraordinary.
He's definitely been... Oh, sorry.
I think he's fascinating, and I always the people who aren't really knowledgeable about how ingenious this company is, I always use the story about Stone Cold with that 316 business, where they go from a simple promo with Stone Cold and Jake, if you're familiar with the promo I'm talking about.
Oh yeah, very familiar.
Oh yeah.
Where he does nothing more than say, "Let me give you Austin 316. I'm going to kick your ass." And they take that 3:16 and they put that on T-shirts, and they sell quadrillions of these things. and they do it at a time which is kind of interesting, because at that time everything was politically correct, and kids were getting tossed out of school if they wore a T-shirt that didn't say the right thing and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And so everybody loved that, because it was sort of a code word for something that most people in authority had no clue. What the heck does that mean? And so you couldn't go to a WWE show for years without seeing the crowd was full of these 316 T-shirts, which, from a marketing standpoint, how ingenious is that? That you can take 3:16 and turn it into that.
He's definitely been a visionary. He's definitely been a marketing genius. But where do you think the other side of Vince comes from? The fearful side, everyone's intimidated of him side. Where do you see that? Have you ever seen that side of him kind of come out?
Not with me, I don't. No, I mean, I've never had that issue with Vince. He's always been. We just have a different kind of relationship. I've never seen. I think he has an obvious physical presence and an aura to him. I always tell people, in your life, you maybe meet 5 people who are just different than everybody else. And it may be your father, it may be some master sergeant in the Marine Corps. In my case, who knows, it might be the Pope. But I think for anybody who meets Vince, he's one of those 5. He's just different. He's a different breed of cat. He has a different presence to him. I think his accomplishments and what he has done probably intimidate people a little bit. But I think he's a very human person, and I think if you just sit down and talk to him like a normal person, that's what he enjoys, and that's what he is.
What do you think makes you two mesh so well together? Because you said the bond and stuff. What has made you guys been so close together?
Probably because we're both, A-type personalities, and I think Vince is kind of like, I have this view: if you haven't done anything wrong, then say so and defend yourself, rather than a lot of these people nowadays. If you're sued and somebody accuses you of something, then the natural tendency is to deny it, hunker down, and or pay somebody to go away. But we just don't do that. We've never done that. And if something has been done wrong, it's going to be done wrong in error, not by intent usually. And if something has done wrong, then you try to fix it. But if you haven't done anything wrong, then you defend yourself. And on a jocular note, when I kid Vince, I don't know if you ever remember seeing, or if you ever saw that movie, The Hustler, the story about Larry Flint. Have you guys ever seen that?
Oh, yes. Yep.
And there's that scene, if you remember, where he's basically been ordered not to leave town, and he's in trouble for doing something with the judge, and he's going to leave town anyway. And he's being drug up the airplane steps in his wheelchair, and his lawyer's standing down at the bottom of the steps, and he's sort of yelling at him, saying, why are you doing this? You know it's going to happen. He said, the judge is going to be angry. Why are you doing all this? And he's yelling at Larry Flint. And Woody Harrelson, who plays Larry Flint, looks at him and goes, why are you yelling at me? I'm the perfect client. I'm rich and I'm always in trouble. and so I always kid Vince, sort of kidding me. I said, you remind me a little bit of that scene, And but he's not always in trouble. And the funny thing is, he doesn't want to be in trouble. He wants his business to be run without legal complications, and most of the time, it is. It's been a pretty smooth road most of the time, with some bumps we had to get over with Ted Turner and his attempts to try to put the company out of business, and the Parents Television Council, and some of those kind of things. But in the main, it's a very professionally run organization, and with some great executives and great talent that support the organization.
Do you think when things like that happen with the PTC and Ted Turner, do you think that Vince takes that very personally, and he kind of takes the personal vendetta that that he's not going to take that he's not going to lose?
Well, I wouldn't say it was vendetta. I think he's a very principled guy. When Turner was doing what he was doing, there was no question that Turner was, targeting the company and trying to put them under, and was taking the intellectual property of the WWE, which was their stock and trade. And when you get to the PTC, there really wasn't much question of what they were doing was incredibly unfair and defamatory, as was eventually shown by what we proved in that case, and they're ended up paying us millions of dollars for what they had done and issuing a very public retraction for the kind of things they had been saying. So I think what makes him different in those situations is not that he reacted. I think that's Vince. Most people in those kind of situations might just say, heck with it, I'm not gonna bother. But he didn't. He wanted to make it right. And when we got into WCW, we found out all kinds of things about what they were doing, and created some interesting law that basically holds that the characters that the WWE created and depicts in these copyrighted works that it owns and possesses is really no different than Batman and Superman and the other characters that you see, and they're entitled to intellectual property protection such that you can't just take, for example, the Razor Ramon character or the Diesel character or those things that the company had created and just steal them. It'd be like stealing the Batman or Superman. And we got legal precedent that protects the company from that kind of action.
In that instance where that was a very public revelation that WCW at that time was trying to portray, the Razor Ramon and the Diesel characters, do you put any onus on the performer themselves for not, having the sense to maybe shed the character, or is that something that WCW as an organization would have been fully responsible for?
I think it was WCW. Look, Scott and Kevin are, back in the fold of the WWE. It's been a long history. They were very talented performers, and it's hard to blame them if you have somebody like a Turner coming and throwing the the money at them that he was throwing at them, to not take it, not go along with it, that they would really have to be reliant upon the organization to tell them whether what they were doing was legal or not legal. So no, I don't blame them. We think it was all orchestrated at the highest levels of Turner. And the fascinating thing about it all was that in the end of the day, if you don't do the right thing, it ends up hurting you. And in the end of the day, after all is said and done, they ended up paying us an awful lot of money to settle that lawsuit, and then that money in turn was used a couple of years later to buy the assets of WCW. So it didn't help them much in the long run, and in the end, WWE ended up owning the film library, among other film libraries that they now have to show on the network.
But it was in 1995. It was an episode of WWF Superstars where it was a taped, pre-recorded, kind of just a quick, about 2.5-minute segment that Vince just came out and addressed a couple of the things that were going on at the time in terms of the New York Post and the articles that they were printing and kind of the vendetta that they had towards some of the attorneys representing the WWF at the time. But would Vince at that point come to you since he had never shed the character before?
I honestly don't remember it. Whatever it was, we probably did talk about it, but I just am drawing a blank on what it was that he did or what it was that provoked him in '95 to do that. I just don't recall.
Definitely an interesting light to see him under coming out and talking about the WWF's business, but also referencing the WWF. Obviously, it's no longer the WWF; it's the WWE. Is that something that took a little bit of time to get used to?
Actually, it was kind of interesting the way that transition took place pretty quickly. It was another one of Vince's clever and genius ideas to just switch one letter. The whole ordeal with the World Wildlife Fund was kind of crazy. Never did understand why they cared, because nobody ever confused us with them. And watching the whole English court proceedings and seeing how different that was than American court proceedings, it was kind of frustrating from my standpoint, because it was the one big case that I couldn't handle. The English courts will not allow American lawyers to try cases in their courtrooms. And so I could only go there and watch, and it was so infuriating to sit there and watch that and not be able to do anything. But whenever they issued their orders that we couldn't be WWF in the way we wanted to be anymore, it was just too burdensome to try to comply with the requirements for what we had to do if we were going to be WWF. And so Vince just came up with the idea, we'll change to WWE, and that I don't know if you remember the slogan, "Get the F out." Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's kind of clever, and now, it actually captures what they do maybe better than the word federation anyway, because they are an entertainment company, and that's exactly what the business is. So it was a very successful rebrand, I thought.
Definitely. He definitely spun it in a positive direction. But, there was another case before that with the USA Network. I believe it was before that. What was the deal? It was something with the rights to the show? Was that the deal with the USA Network lawsuit?
Yeah, well, what was going on, John? What was going on at that time was the Raw program was on the USA Network. At the time, Raw was, and still is, usually the number one rated program on that network. And the company was also, at that time, starting the XFL. So TBS wanted to get rights in the NFL or the XFL and the Raw program and whatnot. And so they started recruiting us to switch the programming from the USA Network to TBS, and made a very lucrative offer for us to do that. USA Network had a contract with the WWE that gave them what's called a matching right. In other words, if somebody else came along and made an offer for the Raw program, and I'm just throwing out a number, it's not the real number, but if they said somebody else came along and said, we'll give you $250 million a year for the Raw program, they had the right to match that, and if they did, then they could keep the company from moving its programming where it wanted to move it to. So what happened is, and the way that contract was set up, once you got an offer from another entity, you had to tender it to USA Network to see if they would exercise the matching right, which we did. And 10 days afterwards, they had to tell us whether they matched or not. Well, instead, they turned around and they sued us in the Delaware Chancery Court and claimed that they did not have to match the stuff that had nothing to do with the Raw programming, such as the XFL rights and other things that TBS was throwing in as sweeteners to get us to move the property, and asked the Delaware Chancery Court, which is a fabled court in America, probably the best court system in America, to enjoin the WWE from moving Raw from the USA Network over to Turner's networks. And so we had to go up to the Delaware Chancery Court and fight that fight out. And we won that one and got the right to leave the USA Network and went on to Turner for, I think it was 3 years or something like that. And the XFL, you know what the story was with the XFL and how that all ended up. But that's what that case was about.
And you've been involved in so many cases. I mean, we could go on forever with all the cases, but there's a couple ones that I really just kind of wanted to get to the heart of and get your opinion on it. And one of them in particular, you know, before we were talking about the WWE Network royalties and that whole thing, and we were kind of in the middle of it. We had a bunch of guys on our show. We were talking about it. Obviously, we've had Rene Dupree on it a couple times. But what was the whole network royalty case, and how come it ultimately, you know, came to court and got dismissed?
Well, I think Dupree was being manipulated by the same lawyer that's been running around bringing these CTE cases against the company. In fact, we know he is. And that whole business started with this guy advertising on the internet looking for people to sue the WWE, and then he's made, you know, various promises and representations to these people about what he thinks he's going to get for them and all the rest of that. After the judge in the CTE cases issued her substantive rulings throwing out entirely 2 of the cases and 5/6 of the other one, while expressing skepticism about whether that claim would survive. Shortly after that, we believe he got Dupree to bring this royalties case as kind of a way to deflect attention from what was happening in the other cases, knowing full well, frankly, that Dupree's case couldn't go anywhere. And as matters turned out, evidently didn't even tell the lawyers that he recruited to bring the case and hide his own involvement, that Dupree had signed not 1, but 2 contracts that prohibited him from bringing such claims. And as soon as the lawsuit was brought to my attention, I sent an email, I think the night they filed it, to the lawyer in Chicago. That, you know, Dupree would not know any lawyers in Chicago. He's from Canada. He was steered there. So I brought this to the attention of the Chicago lawyer and said, look, I assume you don't know this, because any lawyer who saw these documents wouldn't bring this lawsuit, but here's what your client signed, and as you can see, it absolutely prohibits this lawsuit that you brought, and I would demand that you withdraw it immediately. And he wrote back saying, you know, very professionally, thank you, I was not aware of this, we'll look into it. And I'm sure he did, and as the evidence shows, he then withdrew the lawsuit, which was the only proper thing he could have done, frankly. He could not have continued the lawsuit at all once I brought that to his attention. And Dupree would have known it too. I mean, it was all designed, I think, to create some negative publicity for the company and see if they could maybe get somebody better than Dupre to bring such a lawsuit. It's kind of trolling, if you will, for plaintiffs.
Now, with this whole thing, how does that differ from the Doug Summers case and the Gilbert family case?
Well, I don't think it does. They were trying to make it different by making contractual claims, but these claims have never succeeded yet, and they never will. Gilbert, Summers, there's a bunch of cases. There's Freddie Dwyer and a bunch of guys that opted out of the NFL. If you remember, the NFL had similar cases, and they had class action case brought against them for people from former NFL players on the NFL network, which the NFL, as they seem to do, they have a lot of money to throw around, so they chose to settle with that class and pay him some money. But a couple guys, including Freddie Dwyer and the rest, I think about 12 other guys, opted out of that class and brought their own lawsuits alleging that the NFL owed them more money, I gather, than what they would have gotten through the class action settlement. And it was kind of a dumb move because now you have to survive motions to dismiss that can be filed against such claims, and the NFL did, and they lost, and the court threw their claims out. Basically, the way the law works on this stuff is pretty simple. I mean, we're the owner of the copyrights of all of these things. The WWE is the sole and exclusive owner of the copyrights. Federal copyright law rewards, if you will, the people who make the investments in creating these copyrighted works, who go out and hire the talent and the audience, or the stadiums and the cameras and, all the expense of creating these films, with exclusive rights of display, reproduction, and sale. And so when these people come in and say, well, you're being unjustly enriched and I'm not getting any of this money, the defense is always federal copyright law gives us the exclusive right to do it and preempts any of these state law claims that you're trying to assert that would burden our rights of ownership, and they get thrown out every time. I'm not aware of any that have ever succeeded and gotten past the preemption argument when they try these state law claims. What they were trying to do here was a little bit twist on that. They had those state law claims that would have gotten tossed out if they had not signed this contract, but they were trying to bend the contract language into somewhat of a contract claim to try to claim that they were entitled to these monies under the terms of Dupre's contract, which wasn't correct either, but we never had to get into that because of what I told you previously. He had signed that prohibited him from even asserting that claim.
Right. And we can...
I hope that answers your question for you.
Yeah. And what's interesting is because we were talking about the network, and we're talking about how WCW is on there, and obviously it's great. You get all this footage, you get all those stuff, and then there's ECW on there as well, and there's many other leagues. But what is the reason why a guy from ECW or a guy from WCW doesn't have, the right to get any sort of royalties from the WWE network? Was that in their contract previously, or what's the deal with that?
Well, let me just give you an example, using ECW as an example. ECW, if you recall your history, went into Chapter 7 bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm.
In New York, I forget the exact year, but whenever you go into a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, what happens is your assets and your liabilities are marshaled. The bankruptcy trustee tries to sell the assets of the bankrupt estate in order to generate some cash to pay off creditors who would be, for example, any ECW talent that were owed money from ECW, which would share whatever money is available, which usually isn't very much. When you're bankrupt, you don't get very much. And when somebody goes bankrupt, like ECW does, it essentially wipes out all the claims of anybody that they would have against ECW for non-payment of contract royalties or whatever else talent might have claimed against ECW. The assets of the company are put up for sale free and clear of all lien. And that's part of the whole bankruptcy sale when you think about it. Nobody's going to buy assets that carry with it liabilities. It's not going to do that. And so what you had there was you had this entire film library of ECW that would have been sitting somewhere in a cardboard box right now, not being displayed anywhere. And the WWE decided that it would buy and pay money to buy those films and the copyrights that go with those films, and with those copyrights, the rights that I've just described to you, and obtain from the bankruptcy court, which is a normal transaction, a bill of sale giving the WWE, in exchange for the money it paid for those, the sole right, title, and interest in the copyrights to those works. So that's why the WWE has the legal right to display them on the network, free and clear of any claims, plain and simple. And the bankruptcy court actually retains jurisdiction to hold anybody in contempt who tries to assert otherwise. I also, by the way, advised the praise lawyer of that fact, which I don't think he knew either. So I mean, that's what. And you know, when you think about what the WWE's done by making the investment in these films and whatnot, it allows them, most performers, or at least a lot of performers, go through sort of a storied history where they go from one promotion to another to WWE. And if you didn't own all these copyrighted works, it would be not as possible to tell such a good story. For example, if you wanted to tell the life story of Ric Flair, you can now do that because you have all the films of promotions that he performed in. So you can tell his biography and his life story, and you can do that for anybody else who performed for ECW, WCW, and then WWE. You could do it in a seamless fashion, which you couldn't do if you didn't own the copyrights in those works, which we do. And that's the ingenious level by what Vince has done. He's acted to keep much of wrestling history and the history of people alive that would not be alive but for his investment in this stuff.
Definitely, if you think about it, because the network is keeping a lot of the names out there and alive. Do you think that Vince really does love preserving history, and he's the guy that's actually going to be the one preserving the history of professional wrestling?
Yes, and I think that speaks for, you can see it. I mean, by his actions, he is sort of the custodian of the wrestling history right now, and it's been his whole life. It's been the life of his family. It's generational. So yeah, I think he cares greatly about the history of this business, and has great respect for the people who have been part of it and who helped him build it.
Does he ever come to you and say, you know, he's shocked that somebody's suing him, or not that he's mad, but that he's, you know, a little perturbed that this person would come back and try to sue him? Has any of those conversations ever happened between you two?
Well, I can't, John Chad. I hope you understand. I really can't ethically disclose specific conversations that as a privilege. I have to respectfully decline to answer that question because
I guess I was just thinking about the Billy Jack Haynes case and all the stuff that he said, and all the crazy things that he did, whether through his Facebook page or whether through video. What was your whole thought process on Billy Jack Haynes being the basically lead guy to sue for the concussion?
Well, Billy Jack Haynes, I mean, he goes all the way back to the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, he was doing the same stuff then. Everybody in the business knows what he is. The idea that this trolling campaign where you were where this Kairos fellow was out there looking for people to sue, the best you can come up with is a Billy Jack Haynes to supposedly put forward as he's going to be a representative of a class representing all people who ever performed for the WWE. Do you really think for a minute that people like Rock and Stone Cold or think that Billy Jack Haynes is somebody they want representing their interests? I mean, it's ridiculous. And that's basically what he would be doing in that situation. And he was really doing the same thing with him as he just tried to do with the Prey, and that it was make some very sensational charges that were false from the minute they were made. When they were made, we got on the phone with them and said, these charges that you have made are false. You know they're false. If they're not withdrawn, we're going to seek sanctions against you. They quickly withdrew much of what they said there that was absolutely false. They have continued to do the same thing, however. In fact, in the recent opinion that the judge issued, dismissing Haynes' claim and dismissing the claims of McCullough, Sudoka, and Matt White, she actually made findings that they have made false allegations in the lawsuit and noted that there are sanctions motions pending against them, and went on to describe how they have made these just totally inconsistent and sometimes incomprehensible allegations throughout this litigation that they have brought. So, Billy Jack Haynes is just being used. He'll never see one penny for anything. And it's sad, frankly, to see people that maybe are down and out and don't have much money fall for this line that, there's going to be some pot of gold for you at the end of this rainbow when there's not going to be.
And also there was the Singleton-LaGrasso case, which I believe was several cases brought up by them, correct?
That was the second case they brought. After they brought the one out in Oregon, and they brought to their attention that Oregon has a lot of laws against what they were doing. They went searching for another set of plaintiffs, and so they found LaGrasso and the Singleton kid. And then they brought that one in Pennsylvania, which was the wrong place. So, again, I had to point out to them that these guys had all signed contracts whereby they agreed to litigate any claims in Connecticut. So those claims were transferred to Connecticut. Then once they got in Connecticut, they began to realize that Connecticut law weren't too much for their liking. So they brought a third action out in California where they tried to hide who was involved in that, and from the lawyer standpoint, on behalf of McCullough and Sudoka and Wise, again in violation of forum selection clauses that required the case to be brought in Connecticut. That federal judge, as did the federal judge in Oregon, as did the federal judge in Pennsylvania, as did every federal judge so far, ordered against them and ruled that these cases had to go forward in Connecticut. And so that's how they all got to Connecticut. They also brought one down in Tennessee on behalf of Mabel's Whit, and another one down in Texas on behalf of the former girlfriend of Matt Osborne, again in violation of contracts that said those would be in Connecticut. Those federal judges also transferred those cases to Connecticut. So they've lost every motion so far, frankly.
And the Nelson Frazier case with his with his wife, that was a part of the same people were involved in that case as well?
Yes, same lawyer.
Now, as I start to wind it down here, I was very curious about the Benoit thing with Stephanie McMahon. What was the outcome of that, and what was that lawsuit about?
I'm not sure what you're referring to with Benoit and Stephanie.
I guess she had made comments, or they said she had made comments about concussions, and they somehow linked it to the Benoit, I guess around the Benoit case time.
Oh no, you mean in the CTE cases?
Yeah.
No, what they did, and the judge actually, this is another point the judge found, is that they have repeatedly mischaracterized Stephanie's role, and noted after saying so that there were sanctions motions pending about this. What they tried to do is they were trying to come up with a storyline, if you will, that mirrored the NFL. And what got the NFL in trouble in its cases is a much different situation than exists anywhere else. The NFL, the allegation against the NFL was that it had for years this committee, the traumatic brain injury committee, headed by a rheumatologist, not even a neurologist, who had actually published in medical journals and whatnot a bunch of so-called junk science, whereby they were postulating that there was no harm in going back into an NFL game on the same day you got a concussion, for example, and that there was no indication that repetitive head trauma would cause you any kind of long-term problems, and things that arguably misled all the players as to the safety of continuing to perform after they had gotten a concussion, affirmative acts and stuff like that. Well, we never did anything like that. We never had any publications that anybody put out or anything like that. So they were trying to concoct, if you will, out of whole cloth, some nonsensical allegations designed to show that the WWE did something that misled these people. And they don't have anything that they can point to that was ever said or done to any of them that misled them. So one of the things they came up with was this cockamamie allegation that when Stephanie testified before a congressional committee that was sort of asking some questions after the Benoit death, that she had supposedly testified that there were no concussions in WWE's history, which was categorically false. She never said that, and never was asked that. And they knew it. It's all in transcript form, and they knew that wasn't what she said. It's in writing what she said, and then subsequently that was put before the judge of what she said. And as I said, the judge came out with her opinion saying that they had repeatedly mischaracterized what Stephanie did. And this is part of what our problem is with these people. They just make these wild allegations that have no basis in fact, and it's fiction writing. It's not factual in nature at all.
Now, speaking of Stephanie, obviously you've been in the WWE working alongside them for nearly 30 years now, and obviously you've seen Stephanie grow up, and obviously you've seen Shane grow up. Can you just believe how successful that those two have become in the business world, and then even Shane main eventing WrestleMania this year against The Undertaker?
Yeah, I mean, I've watched them grow up from teenagers. They were pretty much teenagers. Well, Stephanie was a teenager when I first started with them. I think she's tremendously talented. She plays her role as well as you can, and in real life, she's just a sweetheart. She's one of the sweetest, nicest people that you'll ever meet. Such a good ambassador for the WWE. I had a chance to watch her in town here a couple weeks ago, and they did Raw, and she was over at the Children's Hospital with Paul, Triple H, with all these kids that are just sick and very problematical, and what she's done is Connor's Cure thing. It's magic to watch the effect that they have on children, and they really enjoy the hell out of doing that. I think they like doing that almost better than they like doing anything else. And Shano, to see him come out at WrestleMania with his three sons and I was kind of laughing when I saw that because I have a grandson that's about 10, and I was thinking to myself, I wonder if my grandson was told to come run down that ramp before 100,000 people, how he would act. Would he be like seeing those kids? And I don't think so. And you watch those kids just coming down there, and it really is in the genes. I mean, that's all you can say is those kids came running down there, and they were not the least bit daunted by the moment. They were getting into it, and I thought, it's the fifth generation. There really is something to that. It's in the blood because they're naturals at it. So it was fascinating to see, to be honest with you.
It's pretty crazy if you look at the lineage of the McMahon family, going from all the way back when to now, and thinking of all the different generations of McMahons that have come through. But, you said you weren't really a fan. And obviously, you became somewhat of a fan as you started working with WWE over the last 30 years. But have you had a favorite wrestler at all, going through all that time?
There's so many, that are good. I would be slighting somebody if I said otherwise. I've gotten to know so many of them, and they're all so talented in their own way. I think we all kind of enjoy, I think everybody enjoys watching Rock just because he's such a natural. The whole shtick that he does is he's just hilarious to watch and so immensely talented. But, having said that, so was Stone Cold, so was Triple H, so was Hulk Hogan, so was Bruno Sammartino. In their own right, they were all legends in the business, and I have great respect for all of the guys that do what they do. They're hardworking people, and they're some of the toughest people on earth.
Do you have any favorite matches looking back, like any that stick out, maybe a couple of them that you really remember fondly and can consider them favorites?
The one I always remember is that ladder match with Razor Ramon. I don't know why, but that was just the first time I think I ever saw a ladder match. I think it was with Shawn Michaels, wasn't it? That one he did in WrestleMania.
WrestleMania 10 at MSG. I was there 18 rows back. It was hell of a night for me, hell of a day for me.
Yeah, I just thought, I don't know why that one always kind of sticks in your mind. And, of course, the Andre Hulk thing was sort of a legendary thing, especially because that was right after I represented Neidhart. And I remember him, when I was starting to learn what he did, he was all worried because he had gotten arrested in January, and he was worried about whether he was going to make this event called WrestleMania. And I said, what the hell's WrestleMania? He says, oh, Christ, you never heard about it? He says, it's in a Pontiac Silverdome. We're going to have 92,000 people. I said, what? You have 92,000 people for a wrestling match? Are you serious? And he said, yeah. So I tuned it in and watched it. Oh, my God, this is pretty incredible. And then the Hulk and the Andre thing, it was pretty remarkable to see that thing. And now, knowing all the history of that in the years since, I come to appreciate it even more. But it's tough to pick a favorite match because you see some of these guys that every time you watch it, you see somebody doing something new and creating some move that you've never seen before. And it's incredible to see how these young people are coming up now. Some of the moves they make, that Neville kid, Christ almighty, the stuff he does is amazing.
Do you have a favorite wrestler now? Like, I know you mentioned Neville and stuff, but is there anybody now that kind of sticks out, part of the newer breed, the new crop of talent?
No, I'm actually enjoying watching a new breed of talent. I think they're all incredibly talented, and it's always interesting to watch the future. I think what has been done with NXT is sort of part of the whole enhancement of the product to see how they now develop talent down there at NXT and the training that they go through and the education that they get on everything. It ensures, I think, the viability of the business for a long time into the future with that kind of talent coming in.
Have they ever asked you to actually appear on camera and a part of a storyline?
No, and I wouldn't. They did ask, though. It's sort of funny. They did ask. I wouldn't do it only because I wouldn't want to do anything that would demean the role I have as the lawyer for the company. I wouldn't want to do that. And but one time they were kind of a funny story. They were coming to town, and it was in Pittsburgh, and it was in the context of that storyline where Rock had somebody had run over Stone Cold in a car or something like that, if I remember the storyline correct. And so Stephanie calls me in my office one day when they come to town. She says, "Jerry, we need a detective. We need somebody to play a detective, just sort of a bit role. Do you have anybody over there that can do that?" And at that moment, one of my partners, a friend of mine by the name of Mark Rush, whose father and brother were both detectives, walks in my office, and I said, "I think I got the guy for you." So he goes over, and he plays his bit part where Rock sort of questioned him, and Mark standing with his little notepad like he's a detective, asking him questions about, do you know who ran over Stone Cold in the car and whatnot? and Rock's doing his thing, and he finally goes to him, "Do you like donuts?" And Mark and Mark goes, playing role, "Yeah, I like donuts." He goes, "Well, let me tell you what you can do with those donuts." Then he goes, "You can stick them straight up your candy ass," the whole thing. Well, so the nenext morning when Mark came to work, there were donuts all over his desk at work, and he literally could not walk down the street of Pittsburgh for a couple of weeks thereafter, where people weren't pointing him out and saying, "Hey, there's a detective," and it was amazing the number of people who recognized him just from that little bit part he did on the show. So I've had partners did it, but I haven't done it myself.
What would you say your legacy is in terms of the pantheon of WWE history?
I would say it's just been a great honor to represent them. I love the company, I love what they do, and I love its people. It has been a professional dream and challenge to represent them because you have to know a lot of different law, be able to try a lot of different cases, and it has been a labor of love. I genuinely have enjoyed every minute of it.
And it was our pleasure to speak with you this evening, and we really sincerely appreciate your time.
Anytime. I enjoyed it, guys, and good luck with your podcast. You're doing great work.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates. Support us on patreon.com for $1.99 a month to watch our full shoot interviews ad-free and help our channel grow. Follow us on Twitter at the Hannibal TV for instant updates.